In 1905, as the Western world looked like a fixed and stable thing, the Spanish-born philosopher George Santayana, who actually grew up in the United States in the Boston area, was warning presciently that famously quoted line that those who cannot learn or remember the past are condemned to repeat it. So 9 years later, the First World War followed, and then the second, and proved him right. Today, as we find ourselves living in conditions and circumstances unprecedented in this country's history, with only a 100-year-old flu pandemic to go by, Professor Jean-Laurent Rosenthal gives us context and framing for the COVID-19 crisis. He's the Ria and Lela Axline Professor of Business Economics and the Ronald and Maxine Linde Leadership Chair in the Humanities and Social Sciences. I'm fascinated to hear what he'll have to tell us. And remember, there's room for your questions when he's done speaking. Thank you, Professor Rosenthal.
Thank you, Pat. And thank you all for coming back virtually, at least for seminar day. And thank you all for the team that made this possible. Before I start, I want to take a second. This is a complicated issue, and talking about pandemics and the economy requires us to talk in quantitative terms about death and disease, about firms closing on unemployment. And while part of what I will show you is that COVID is not as severe as other past shocks of this kind, the tragedies we're experiencing are very, very real. And putting them in a historical context may help us understand why we care so much about saving as many people as we can, and why we're willing to devote such a high level of resources to doing so. So I'm going to make in my short amount of time 4 claims about COVID and the economy. First is that COVID has low mortality by historical standards, and likely also relatively lower morbidity than past shocks. The second one is that past COVID type shocks set the economy back temporarily, rather briefly. Third is that the social response to the COVID pandemic is very large by historical standards. First, because medical responses are effective, even though they're expensive, and because we've chosen to reduce mortality by reducing economic activity at a level that's unheard of in the past. And therefore, claim 4, that the COVID economy looks more like a war economy, a Great Depression, a Great Recession than other pandemics. So next slide, please. I am not a scholar of pandemics. I'm an economic historian, and I'm going to use a particular laboratory to make these claims, which is two centuries of the history of Paris, a place I've actually worked on extensively, which has some advantages. It has actually fantastic data. It has a nearly constant geography. So what you see as Paris around 1800 is pretty much Paris today. It has lots of shocks, so we can actually make some statements about what matter. And a fair amount of the data that I'm going to show you was collected out of archives with a number of colleagues and friends. So on mortality, disease, and infrastructure, I've written a series of papers with Linde Ketzenbaum looking at the diffusion of sewer and water infrastructure by neighborhood in Paris and relating that to the income of the different neighborhoods. I've engaged in a very long-running project on wealth in Paris with Gilles Postel-Vignet and Thomas Piketty, and you'll see some of that data today. With Phil Hoffman at Caltech and Gilles Postel-Vignet again, we put together a mortgage series that runs from 1670 to 1870, and again, we'll use that series to look at the impact, the interaction between pandemics and credit activity. And finally, because enterprise formation plays such an important role in the economy, we'll look at some enterprise formation data that I put together as part of a project with Naomi Lamoureux at Yale. Next slide, please. And the first part that I want to work, the first part of what I'm going to talk about involves, next slide again, thank you, is a comparison of COVID to cholera, which was the major pandemic of the 19th century. And we'll use that to learn how to contrast background and crisis mortality. Now, before we do this, and because all of us are from Caltech, you're already raising your eyebrows thinking, well, wait a second, cholera is a bacteria, COVID is a virus. Those two things are different, transmission mechanisms are different, the pathologies are different, everything's different, how could you do this? Well, remember before 1860, people really could not tell the difference. They had no understanding of transmission. And even though they knew very well that the symptoms of influenza and other respiratory diseases were different from cholera, they really did not understand very much of this. And if you look at this, the reports done for 1832, there's enormous amounts of pages devoted to trying to figure out whether the mortality of individuals is different by the floors at which they live or the width of their street, because they still believe that cholera is possibly, like many other diseases, transmitted through the air. They found out that the floors at which you lived didn't matter very much. The width of the street did, because narrow streets were associated with poor neighborhoods. So to contrast background and crisis mortality, we'll go to the next slide, which is my first data slide. And that slide displays monthly mortality for the 29 years from 1828 to 1856, where I've arrayed all the months one at a time. So all the Januaries are together, 1828, 1829, 1830, all the way to 1854, 55, 56. And if you look at that figure, the thing you'll find is that there's a relatively regularity to this, where mortality is about 2,000 individuals a month, and a little bit more in the winter month, a little bit less in the summer month. And if you drew a line around about there, you would essentially call that the background mortality. It's essentially the sort of average regular mortality that occurs as people die of a variety of different things, and all of everything else averages out. But then you can also see these very large spikes, one in orange, 1832, one in blue, which is 1849, and one in green, which is not so severe, but there's many different months, is 1844. And those are the three major cholera epidemics of Paris in the 19th century. So if we go to the next slide, what I want to emphasize is those shocks are relatively rare, about once a decade, but they're very, very severe, okay? Now, this is the same data you saw before, except compiled on a daily basis. So you can really see the upswing and the downswing, and you can think about a lot of the daily reports we get about COVID. For 1849, 1854, the data come from statistical compilations produced by the city of Paris around 1860. And I couldn't find the 1832 data, but I knew that was the worst one. And so I really wanted to find that. And one day I was actually bored. So I thought, I'll just read the newspaper for April 1832 and find some funny stories to tell you. But there it was on the front page, April 1, the death totals for that day. And so all I had to do was read the paper from March 9th till the end of October and put the data together. So that orange series that you're seeing there is, you're the first people to ever see it. It was not compiled in 1832. It's never been compiled. And now let's sort of do some scaling. So the Paris population in 51 is roughly 1 million. To get the equivalent mortality that you're seeing in August of 1854, which is roughly 100 deaths a day, you'd have to get to 1,000 deaths a day in LA County or 1,000 deaths a day in New York City. To get to the death totals of 800 in 1832 would be 9,000 daily deaths, which are twice as many as expected in California overall by most of the forecasters, and 40% of all the deaths to date in New York City. So, and this is a one-day death total for Paris. COVID by historical standards is not a severe demographic shock. But let's put the cholera years in perspective. And if we go to do that, we'll go to the next slide. So that's a slide for those of you who saw the short piece that was put on the Caltech website. This slide reproduces part of that data and adds one thing. So you can see these are death totals by age group. And so the orange and yellow are people aged less than 20. And then the green are 40 to 60, and blue is 60 and above, which you can think about as the adult population. And in black is the total population of Paris, with a big spike up on the annexation of Paris in 1860. And in pink is the mortality, which is simply the ratio of the total mortality divided by the population. And so you can immediately see our three spikes of the cholera of 1832, 49, and 54. And if you look carefully, you'll see the smaller last spike of cholera in Paris in 1866. But the other part of this is that there's this long-term trend of decline in mortality, which is associated first with elimination after 1880 of infant mortality over the next 70 years. And for the practical purposes, by 1960, infant mortality and child mortality are negligible. And the deaths are, of course, because we all have to die someday, are replaced by mortality among the groups of people who are above 60. The last piece that I really want to emphasize is that after World War II in Paris, all mortality is background mortality. The thing that's different about COVID is we've never had a shock of this kind since the Spanish flu that's associated with a pure biological shock that's as sharp as COVID. The mortality from AIDS was large. The mortality from the opioid epidemic or the heroin epidemics are large, but they occur over a long period of time. There's no sharp 1 month where the kinds of mortality aggregates that we've been experiencing occur. If we move to the next slide, we can then revise this claim. COVID has low mortality by historical standards, and crisis mortality is essentially absent in the West after World War I, and it is now essentially absent from the rest of the world, absent mortality caused by social disruptions like wars or civil wars or other kinds of things like that. Now, I really want to emphasize that crisis mortality is small in historical perspective, does not make it unimportant. It is in some sense one of our greatest achievements that we've eliminated crisis mortality. So when it recurs, we're not very happy. And so we're going to want to do something about that. So, so this is not a talk so much about mortality as it is about the interaction between mortality and the economy. So we're going to now move to the economy. So if we could have the next slide. So we're going to ask questions about what happened to poverty and cholera and what are the consequences of cholera. And for that, we're going to use estate taxes. First, they tell us a lot about who dies, and they tell us about how wealthy people were. And as part of this project that I mentioned with Thomas Piketty and Gilles Postel-Binet, we collected this data for everyone once every 5 years in Paris from 1807 to 1872. And if you notice, these are years in 7 and 2, which includes 1832. And initially, what we were primarily interested in dealing with this is if we were not so much interested in the wealth of the people who die as the wealth of the living. And there's this very standard method for converting wealth of the people who die back into wealth of the living that's called the estate multiplier method. And it assumes that death is orthogonal to wealth. And we know that's not true. So we're trying to figure out some way of getting at that. So we thought, well, the cholera is great because people didn't see it coming. They got caught in it. And so we'll get a sample that's less selected. Unfortunately, I'm going to show you that's not the case. The victims are mostly poor, which is not surprising. And we're finding that now as well, that in fact, shocks of any kind are worse for the poor than the rich, because low-income people are often more exposed to shock for a variety of reasons, including they work in more crowded areas. Think about the difference between the cashier at your supermarket versus the accountant or the CEO of your supermarket. They're also often live in more crowded areas. So when somebody in the family gets sick, it's harder to isolate that person from everyone else. And they're often in worse health conditions. And then there's a very simple, straightforward fact that wealth provides resources to buffer shock. So if you're unemployed, you can draw down your wealth. If you have no wealth, things are more complicated. Let's look at this data. And if you can I have the next slide? What I've done is given you the two pieces of information. And what I've done is I've scaled these values to their values in 1832. So in orange is the share of individuals who die wealthy, which if you look at 1827 and 1837 are significantly higher. In fact, the 1822 value is the lowest that we have for the entire 19th century. Only 22% of the people who die in Paris die wealthy. And in case you think there's some selection that might happen like in things like probates, the Paris estate tax or the French estate tax binds on the first franc, so everybody has to pay it. And at that time, there are no thresholds or exemptions or anything like that. And we have a significant number of estates that involve a couple months worth of wages or the equivalent thereof. So this is a real decline, and this is just evidence that the cholera hit neighborhoods and individuals that were poorer harder than neighborhoods that were richer and individuals that were richer, even though we have to admit that the prime minister did die of the cholera and the king's sister did get the cholera. She recovered, died in 1847, and we know her wealth because she died in 1847. So average wealth is the green line, and you'll notice that that is upward trending. That is not surprising. Wealth was rising in Paris over this period of time, but you'll notice again, there's a very sharp difference between 1832 and 1827 or 1837. So about a 30% difference in average wealth. No, I did not make up this figure to make it match the decline in the stock market that we experienced in March and April. Some of that just comes from this larger proportion of individuals who die who have nothing, but some of it also comes from decline in asset values. And those are the two significant effects of the cholera of 1832. And the second one is of equivalent size to the decline in wealth that's associated with the financial crisis of 1857, which is sparked by Napoleon III's decision to intervene in Italy to help Italian unification, which the stock market thought was a really, really bad idea. Turned out, the stock market was wrong. Napoleon III was right. It didn't last very long. Everything was fine. So think about these as sharp temporary shocks without long-term effects on wealth accumulation. Okay? This is a more general lesson for most biological shocks that we can track. They have very sharp effects at the moment that they happen. They don't have a lot of persistence. And of course, they're distributed across the population in very different ways. So children who are orphaned have horrible lives on average relative to children whose parents actually survive for a whole variety of reasons. But the society on average is able to weather these shocks, even though they're very severe. So this will get me to claim 2. Next slide, please. Past COVID type shocks with temporary setbacks on long-term growth. And we're going to stay in Paris to make this case and look at 3 different things. We're going to look at wealth over a longer interval than just that interval around 1832. We're going to look at credit markets, and we're going to look at business formations. And again, some of these things we could do in other places. Paris is one of the rare places where the data are good enough that we can look at all of those things in a given place. So if I can have the next slide. This is the first sort of long-term slide. It describes average wealth in orange, scaled to the value in 1912. And what you can see is from 1807 to around 1890, average wealth in Paris is multiplied almost by a factor of 10, actually somewhere about 8.5. Then there's a plateau between 1890 and World War I, and then a very steep decline, only interrupted briefly in the 1920s, and a nadir in 1947. So after World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II, average wealth in Paris in real terms had returned, roughly speaking, to what it was in 1807. Then there was a very rapid recovery that doesn't quite get back to the early levels for reasons that I don't want to get into today, and that doesn't matter. Now, there's a very simple way of thinking about COVID and the economy. All the biological shocks are on the left side of your picture, the stuff that occurs before 1890. Remember, 1880, 1890 is the period of declining mortality and declining variability in mortality. All the big social shocks are actually on the right side of this picture after 1912. And you could think about that as a very simple test about the importance of biology in the past versus social interventions. Now, the other thing is that these shocks are very, very large, and they're relatively undifferentiated. The path of the 1%, which if you look at it is a slightly darker line among the other 3, is very, very similar to the path of the average. The top 1/10 of 1% is more variable and has a higher peak. But again, if you had to describe this quickly, there's not much difference across the fractiles. The big changes are in average wealth over time. And with, despite large numbers of biological shocks in the 19th century, rapid wealth accumulation, despite a decline in biological shocks in the 20th century, very rapid declines in wealth, then followed by some recovery. If I can have the next slide. This is an inequality slide, and in the interest of time, I'm just going to go through this very, very quickly to emphasize that there's some variation in inequality. There's a bit of an instability, but on average, the variations in the distribution of wealth are much, much smaller than the variations in the average value of wealth. The last piece here is if you look very carefully at the data after 1917, you'll see that the lowest fractiles, which are at the bottom, so that little sliver of orange down at the bottom of the figure is the wealth share of all the population between the median and the 80th percentile. There's a few wealthy people below the median, but not very many. And you'll notice that's extremely small, but it's growing. And again, the wealth share of people between the 80th percentile and 95th percentile, was the next sliver, is growing. And that's associated with both the rise of retirement programs and the rise of individual savings that are complements to retirement programs. And we'll leave it at that. So if we can have the next slide, let's look at credit markets. And there I bracket, it's a different chronology. So we started in 1784, 5 years before the French Revolution, and we end in 1870, just before the Franco-Prussian War. The data was not available. We did this study to do the period that followed. So we stopped around then, but if you want to, we can go back another 120 years back in time before 1784. And so this is a figure where the cholera shocks, 1832, 54, and 49 are bracketed by 2 huge social interventions. On the left, you have the French Revolution. And the French Revolution, during this period of time, the government being a bit short on money, prints paper money at a very, very high rate. So there's extraordinarily rapid inflation. all the debts are nominal fixed interest debts, and people just wait until the currency has fallen by 99% and then reimburse their debts. So it's a huge transfer of wealth, not only from the private sector to the government, but also within the private sector between debtors and creditors. The market recovers over time. There's a lot of volatility. I'll come back to that. And then there's an innovation on the other side in which the government charters a national mortgage bank, the Crédit Foncier de France, which very rapidly gets going. And if you walk around Paris next time you go there in your sanitized airplane, and you find buildings that are built between 1860 and World War I, 90% of them were built with financing of this bank. This bank is responsible for the construction of Paris as we see it today. In between, there's volatility, but I will tell you, and I checked, I did go back to some of the more fine-grained data. You cannot find the cholera epidemics in these data. What's driving the ups and downs are the Napoleon's loss of power, the 1830 revolution, the 1848 revolution, and things of that sort, not biological shocks. Last slide on the economic consequences. So the other piece that's very important to the economy that we can actually track for Paris is new business formations, because at the time that Napoleon put in commercial law after the revolution, there was a requirement that all multi-holder firms register with the local commercial tribunal so people could know what was going on. And you could think about this a little bit like our doing business as notices. The US adopted similar things for the registration of corporations, but we've never required the registration of partnerships. So if you ask somebody how many partnerships were there in the US in 1965, nobody knows. In France, we do. And so the partnerships are in green. There's a major innovation in 1925, which creates a private limited company, something that the US waited until about 1985 to do. And then the corporations are in yellow. Now, again, you can look at this series. This is relatively aggregate. It's probably hard for you to think about where 1832 is. Well, the data starts in 1833. We'll get the data for the first 3 decades of the 19th century relatively soon. But you can't find either 1849 or 1854. What you can find is 1848, the revolution of 1848. You can find a big V at the time of the Paris Commune and the Franco-Prussian War around 1870. You can find a big decline around World War I, another big decline during the Great Depression in World War II, and then this big spike during the reconstruction of Paris where the government required people to create these forms to get subsidies for rebuilding Paris and recapitalizing different things. And then you can see the rapid rise in the demand for organizational forms in the modern economy. So again, in the periods that we are accustomed to having large biological shocks, our economic indicators don't pick them up very much. Next slide. So history suggests biological shocks were very severe and not so important. What I want to claim is that our social response has been at a very huge scale. So there's two broad views. You can think about this. First, that there's a higher value of life now than in the past. That may be true, but it's very, very hard to measure, and somehow I doubt it. The other possibility is that there's a higher ability to respond, and I think that's very much true. That one of the big benefits of our knowledge economy is a massive ability to intervene in our societies for the good. And so we have seen a very, very large scale medical response where our goal has been across the world to try to treat every ill person from COVID. That's expensive and it's very unusual. If you want to think about the response for cholera around the 1830s, and it was even worse in the 18th century, what they tried to do is isolate people they could find who had the disease, but they tended to park them all together, which actually made their survival risk probabilities or survival probabilities even lower than they would have been otherwise. So, and then globally, many societies and individuals sacrifice income for lower COVID exposures. Stay-at-home orders have never been attempted on this scale. Social distancing at the city level sometimes small states in Europe would attempt to isolate themselves by creating quarantines at their borders. These were never very effective. Next slide. So this gets me to claim 4, which is the COVID economy looks more like a war economy, a Great Depression, or Great Recession, other pandemics. And to do this, we have to scale COVID by 328 million, which is our population. So the first thing is relatively few workers have fallen ill or died. There's been 1.5 million positive tests, a fatality rate of 6%, and many of the fatalities have involved the elderly, many of whom are no longer in the labor force. So the direct effect of COVID on the labor force is actually relatively small. Hospital stays are very numerous relative to the number of people usually hospitalized. because about 14% of infected individuals in a variety of different countries end up having a hospital stay, and those stays are expensive. But again, relative scale back to the population, those numbers are relatively small. We can afford this. It's the third bullet of our interventions that matter. Job losses are very big, 22 million so far. There are some estimates, including by the Secretary of Treasury, that these could reach 25% of the labor force. Current estimate by the Federal Reserve suggests that 40% of individuals who had a job in February that paid them less than $40,000 a year have lost their jobs. Those are huge effects that really are quite different from things that we've experienced in the past, or even that were experienced in the past during these pandemics. Next slide. So what about the post-COVID economy? So here, I think I don't actually have a forecast about what the economy will look like in a year or two. And I think anybody who does, you should wonder about how they're able to resolve that many uncertainties. But I think there are four types of questions that we should all be asking ourselves. The first is, for firms that survive the COVID, and which many of them there will be, how many workers will rematch with their previous employers if their employers are willing to rehire them? And so you can think about this as there's two different issues at stake. One is the workers may have moved on to other jobs because they couldn't wait this long. But the other issue is that the employers may need fewer jobs. So if restaurants engage in spacing their tables out much more, what'll that do with their wait staff? So that's exactly this rematch issue in the post-COVID economy. Many firms will actually, in fact, not reopen. This is the not fun part about these kinds of phenomena. So how fast will new businesses arise, and in what kinds of employment demand will they have? These are questions to which we don't have answers now. And it's a little bit like when we're trying to forecast the path of the epidemic. You're seeing the decline, but forecasting the recovery on the basis of the rate of decline is a very hazardous proposition. There are also issues with capital. There are certain kinds of capital that we probably have too much of. Cruise ships being a good example, malls probably another. With restaurants, if we all want to go out to restaurants as much as we did before, then we don't have enough restaurants if we're going to space out the tables more. And so how do we actually reorganize this stuff? How quickly do we do this? It's certainly clear we can't turn cruise ships into restaurants, but those are really important issues in terms of how the capital will be redeployed. And then if COVID persists, remember my 1854 issue where COVID lasted cholera lasted many months at a relatively low rate. There will be real incentives for firms that can't to accelerate automation so they can space out those workers that they still need on a greater basis. So those are on the supply side of the world. Then there's demand. Do individuals maintain social distance? What does that do for leisure? We have become societies that expend large amounts of resources on leisure, and most of us don't spend our leisure by going out to the desert by ourselves. We go to movies, we go to restaurants, we go to concerts, we go on cruises, we take airplane flights. We do all sorts of things that involve putting us in social situations. Think about Old Town Pasadena. Old Town Pasadena in the evenings is crowded. Well, if individuals maintain social distance, there'll be fewer people in all of these activities. There's a second issue. With more uncertainty, will savings rates increase? So in the short run, what's happening is we're focusing more on the fact that people who have lost their jobs are getting some help from the government, but usually not enough to make up for their past expenses. And so they're drawing down on their wealth. That's dissaving. But for individuals that are still employed, you're facing some uncertainty. You're not sure you'll have your job in the future. You may actually be facing some issues where somebody in your family is going to end up with COVID and you'll have to do some social isolation. Your incentives are to save because the likelihood of a future shock has gone up. If savings rates increase, there'll be less demand. There'll be less demand. Firms will rehire fewer workers. So this is a classic story of general equilibrium. And then, of course, there's government. We are going to increase the national debt by $4 trillion if things go really well, by more if things don't go so well. I actually, and I'm going to make one forecast, we're not going to do this without changing the fiscal system. The world of low taxes that we've been living in for a long time is going to have to end as a result of this. And I think that there's going to be an issue about only having taxes on income. There's going to have to be some taxes on capital. Those are going to be complicated political issues. And that uncertainty about how we resolve that is going to feed back in the first three issues. And then, of course, COVID's a health share shock. What do we do about healthcare? This has been heavily debated in this country. it's going to come back, and it's going to then feed back into the tax issue, because if the government's going to get more involved in healthcare, that's going to be a cost. So that's sort of the way I think you should start thinking seriously about the future of the COVID economy. And now for my last slide, please, I want all of us to put our hope and faith in science and technology. Social distancing and stay-at-home orders are important tools, but they're not social solutions. The cholera analog is, the social solution to the cholera was boil your water. But to get there first, you had to have some scientific discovery that there was a bacteria, that it lived in water, and that was its focus of transmission. But the real solution came from clean water and sewer technologies, which we put in place at extraordinarily high cost in all cities in the world in the 1880s to essentially the 1920s, and in the developing world later on. And also some major medical changes into treating people who had contracted cholera. But essentially the frequency of cholera outbreaks has dropped precisely because of the clean water and sewer technologies. So some science and some engineering. And for COVID, we face exactly the same thing. We have to develop a vaccine, which I think of as largely a scientific issue. And then we actually have to develop the technologies to mass produce it. And that's going to be a very serious challenge. And if you want to think about other medical interventions to reduce the impact of COVID, those two issues are right there front and center. And from my point of view, this is why places like Caltech exist. And this is why you alums and fellow alums get the education that you get at Caltech. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rosenthal. And we want your questions, of course. Click on the Q&A. Let's see. Scott, who's an associate, says, life and death is a binary endpoint. Long-term post-viral illnesses are associated with ongoing costs. What are the limitations of comparing the two?
So obviously, historical analogies are never very, very good. They're never perfect. So that's part of why we need to interpret the data. We collect the data. There are some obvious things. And so you survive cholera, there's a lot of people who's, first, the mortality rate on people contracting cholera in 1832 was incredibly high. The fact that you may actually be in worse shape afterwards is an issue. There was a lot of discussion in the second half of the 19th century about hours lost to people who were not well. But I just want to say, I wouldn't want to say take the lessons of cholera as a guide to what you want to do with COVID. The only piece I will show you is if you go back to that slide with the 3 peaks, we don't know whether COVID looks like a double bump, which is 1832, a single bump, which is 1849, or a long drawn out affair. That is just keep those ideas in mind, because as you're thinking about what you need to do, you can't privilege one of these things because we don't know as much about the interaction of the virus today with the population. But on the other hand, the question is absolutely apt, which is, it is the people who are ill and who are ill long-term that are in some sense our biggest concern. The person who is very elderly and would have likely have died relatively soon, who dies of COVID, is a tragedy, but in a sense, on an economic point of view, it's not such a big deal. It's just a personal tragedy, which is horrible, but we have to be careful between these two things.
Gary from the class of 74 says, is there a way to compare what the cholera spike actually was to what the COVID-19 spike might have been in the absence of a global shutdown?
So this is something I've struggled with, and my guess is, so when Caltech shut down on March 15th, I think all of us said, oh, that's fine because, incubation rate of 2 weeks, isolation rate of 2 weeks. So, okay, think about it in 3 weeks, well, things will be better. And okay, so double that because you want to be super conservative. So March 15th, everybody's back at work on the end of May. It's gone. It's just, we've erased it. And so one of the things that we didn't understand about this issue, and it's a very complicated issue, is the fact is a large fraction of the economy remained open by necessity. A large part of the healthcare system, a large part of the transportation system, your supermarkets and so forth. And social distancing as well as appropriate personal protective equipment measures took a long time to put in place. And so one of the things that we have done is in California is we've reached a plateau of, make it 80 or 90 deaths a day, make it 1,500 new cases a day, and we seem to have a hard time driving it down. Now, if you look spatially, the disease was worse in Northern California, then it seems to have been really bad in LA County. LA County seems to be doing a bit better. If this continues, then it'll have moved on to other places. So the one thing that I worry about, which is very different for cholera, if your water supply is in bad way, it's really local. So, Paris is on a river. There's pretty good evidence that upriver, there was a problem because the department that's just to the north on the Seine is, had a bad cholera epidemic, nothing like Paris. Rouen, which is the next big city down, did not have much of a cholera epidemic. So it's a relatively localized phenomenon. And yes, people can move it around, but it's not nearly as contagious as COVID. And I think that we really have not been able to grapple with that. At the same time, COVID is not so overwhelmingly contagious that we're getting anywhere close to herd immunity. We're very, very far from, so we're in this kind of intermediate place, which is why 1854 keeps coming back to me, this low grade, long running thing. So that's sort of the way I would put it.
Here's Julie from the class of 14. What are some of the economic factors that you expect will, quote, come out better on the other side of this pandemic? What systems are ready for improvement?
So here's the problem, and for those of us alums who have dabbled in finance, it's very difficult to set up your financial portfolio for shocks that occur once 100 years. And so right now we're at a frequency of large-scale biological shocks of this kind at once every 100 years. So if you said, we really need to have, 1 billion disposable PPEs because of the next shock, well, if we think it's going to happen in, 2120, those PPEs won't be very good. So there's a real issue about how to deal with this. There's some infrastructure things we want to do, but not that much, unfortunately. There is an issue that I think we should be able to come out better, but it will depend on a bunch of politics. COVID has been spatially incredibly differentiated in every country that it's hit. The densest places tend to do worse. It's worse in London than the rest of England. It was worse in Paris than in the rest of France. It's worse in New York than lots of other places, which means that if every state has to buy stock of ventilators, we're going to have way more ventilators than we need. So having national stockpiles of valuable resources that we can deploy at we may want a larger stockpile than we have, but the most important thing is let's not decentralize it and not make this a LA County responsibility or a city of LA responsibility, because for all the next place that gets hit is Chicago, not LA. And we want to be able to use the same resources to deal with that spatial differentiation, which there is some logic to it, but some of it is just really strange. So, I think the lessons learned are going to be very, very hard to take place. The US news media has not made much of Sweden, which has twice the mortality of its neighbors because it didn't do a lot of social distancing. On the other hand, California was very aggressive in social distancing, and we never had a huge spike, but we haven't put it away. So it's going to take a lot of time, and this is where science extends into the social sciences, because we're going to actually try to understand human behavior better and human virus interaction.
I'd like to ask you a labor question and go back much farther than the Paris epidemics in the 14th century with the plague sweeping across Europe. In England, it destabilized the feudal system. You had feudal lords who died and their serfs went wandering, or serfs who just left, and they created, for the first time, a competitive labor force. They could go to where jobs would pay them more, and because labor was scarce, that happened, until the crown in a command economy cracked down on them and said, no, you're locked down labor-wise where you are. We talk about the people who cook food and serve food, and certainly hospital workers, as the heroes. What will come out of this? Will we start paying these people better? Will we see better services, fewer but better services perhaps? How will the labor force change in that regard?
So the Black Death is the thing that is on people's mind, but I had a slide about this, but in trying to get it in time, I cut it. So roughly speaking, in most of Europe, a quarter of the labor force disappeared, but the plague didn't kill cows. It didn't destroy houses. It didn't unclear land. And so what happens is when the shock sort of kind of recedes, it takes a while because it's a very severe shock, and the plague actually continues to recur in Europe at ever lower increments into the 1720s. So 1347 is when it arrives in Marseille. By the way, my family's from Marseille, so I know that place well. And then it goes through Europe, and that's when most of the mortality happens. But then the society is very destabilized. But there's this effect that it completely changes the terms of trade between capital and labor, because all of a sudden labor is relatively abundant. It's is relatively scarce. Capital is relatively abundant because you have the capital stock to deal with way more people. And so all of a sudden things change in a way that's very different. And as Pat suggested, in the west of Europe, they largely let the serfs go free to create a competitive labor market. In Eastern Europe, in a series of political decisions, they actually clamped down on serfdom. So some of these issues about how labor markets are going to evolve are politically motivated. You can think about the need for more workplace safety. And this is just directly into COVID. Unfortunately, the problem here is the effect on the labor force is relatively low. And my expectation is over the next 5 years, we're not going to go back to this moment of very, very low unemployment. And so, I would really like to see wages go up, but I don't see it there's not a lot of forces that are going to push that unless we make these as political decisions, like raising minimum wage, right? We can achieve these things by political decisions. The other part that I think is a little complicated is that the incentives to automate have risen. That's never good for workers. It's good for capital. Because as an investor, the robot makers and all these other kinds of activities are going on. So it is much more like, in that sense, cholera, because in cholera, all these people who died were replaced by our estimates, within 3 years into the Paris population by migration. And so, there is a view that, people are not going to want to live in New York City because it's so dense, it's dangerous, and so forth. And so they're all going to go and live in small towns in the Midwest where it's less dense and therefore they're less exposed to these things. I actually don't think that's going to happen. The population is just, if some people leave New York, other people will come and take their place, because historically people have been attracted to these high activity places, including people who don't make very high wages.
Here's a question about capital from Grace from the class of '81. Are there examples of taxing capital in history, and what were the results on the economy?
So the history of taxation has been a more even balance between the taxation of capital and labor until, if you'd like, somewhere between the end of World War II and the Reagan Revolution. By the time of the Reagan Revolution, the argument was, if you want to get investment, you got to lower the tax on investment. And you can teach that model in Ec 11. It works great because I'm giving the investors a high incentive because they're going to make more money. The problem is highly educated workers are a complement to capital. Healthy workers are a complement to capital. So there's a value to capital, or to those of us who have wealth, to contribute to this, because we like the people that we buy services from to be healthy, well-educated, and so forth. This is not an argument that has had a lot of currency in the West in the last 30 or 40 years. That was, in some sense, the argument that was put in place in the very high growth years of the 50s and 60s. And then with the oil shocks, people started to question that model pretty heavily, and they went to something else. And so oftentimes what happens is our economic models are somewhat more, if you'd like, context dependent. And so after the stagflation of the 70s, when people started to argue that we should lower the tax on capital, it seemed like a good idea. It turned out in the 80s and 90s, the economy started growing again. That looked like that was the reason for it, maybe. And the other thing that's happened since then, although that I think is less of an issue, is it's very easy to move your wealth around the world. A little less easy now than 20 years ago, but it's still very easy. And so then you can go back to the 1890s, to that peak of aggregate wealth, and also the peak of inequality worldwide at the time. That's a period where, the West invests all over the world. Tax rates on capital are relatively low, and the politics are all of these conflicts between the wealthy and the poor. And it boils all the way down to debates about how you deploy sewer and water infrastructure in cities across the world.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Just a question from Ananth. Could you separate your comments on public and large companies versus a small business environment, and would your answer be different for one versus the other?
Well, some of the large public companies in retail are, have already gone bankrupt. So we have some of that evidence.
Hey, Drew, a moment of silence.
And yes, I think small companies often have fewer resources. Bankruptcy is a process that we've used to reorganize, including large publicly traded company, because we want to avoid liquidation. Liquidation is incredibly inefficient. But the local paint store, the local restaurant where they borrowed a bunch of money, they were in business for a year, and they owe a lot of money to the bank for the design of the space. They have to pay rent. It's starting to look like a very odd proposition to you to continue to accumulate debt as an entrepreneur, and so you may just shut the door. And there's also a way in which the bank may force you to shut the door. So in a way, the bigger the firm, the higher its survival probabilities, but that's actually a general pattern. The place that you have to worry about is the leisure industry, because there are, issues of scale. You can't run half cruise ships. There are many of these other kinds of things that are complicated. And by the way, this goes all the way to what do you do about cultural institutions like museums? They're dependent on density, and they have no buffer. They have an incredibly valuable stock of stuff that they're not able to sell their art. So there's a lot of adjustment in this economy that is going to have to take place unless we wake up on the 1st of July and say, COVID's gone, which, by the way, was the story, roughly speaking, with SARS and MERS. It never became a pandemic, really.
Barry, who's a donor, would like to know some differences in how long the developing world might take to rebound in Africa, for example, vis-a-vis the developed world.
So, one thing that's complicated about Africa is such a huge proportion of their population is under the age of 20, and the lethality and the severe complications for people under age 20 are very small. So that is actually a protective effect. The second issue that's complicated for very poor countries is because they have a poor medical infrastructure, a lot of people will die at home. By the way, that's what we see in the cholera in 1832. Most people don't die in hospital. First, they're too scared to go to the hospital, and second, because there's not much to do and they can't afford it. So they will likely have more intense crisis, under-recorded mortality, because they will not be able to check what people died of. And so we will use the classic, let's look at the mortality in the last 2 or 3 years and difference that from the mortality that is experienced in 2020 to generate that crisis mortality that we will attribute to COVID. That is likely to be relatively large. On the other hand, the ability of a heavily agrarian economy to engage in social distancing is more limited because it's very difficult to stop the farmer from going to their fields. So the problem for the developing world is, they're poor. And so that means that economic losses, however temporary, are very painful. So that's more where it's going to be, but it's going to take a longer time for us to digest this, because the mortality totals as well as the illness totals, as the testing rates are all going to be lower, except for very small places.
Professor Rosenthal, thank you so much. We've been able to bookend so much of the COVID crisis with the medical, the historical, and the economic issues, and thank you for helping us to do that. We're going to wrap up this unprecedented online seminar day with Ralph Amos. He's the executive director of the Caltech Alumni Association. I know you've heard enough from me, so thank you very much. You've been a wonderful audience, and have a grand time.
Thank you so much, Pat, for your time, talent, and great energy that you led to this very special day. Again, my name is Ralph Amos. I'm the executive director of Alumni Relations here at Caltech, and it's indeed a pleasure and an honor to be with you today on this special day, Seminar Day, our 83rd. And please join me in thanking all of our wonderful presenters who are with us today, to include President Rosenbaum, David Ho, who is a distinguished alumnus and a trustee and an AIDS researcher, Professors Katie Bellman and Azita Amami, Alumni Association President Chris Bryant, Vice President and Director of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory Mike Watkins, Chair, Division of the Humanities and Social Sciences and alumnus Jean-Laurent Rosenthal. And of course, again, Patt Morrison, who's a LA Times journalist, author, radio television personality, and a 2-time Pulitzer Prize recipient. We are very fortunate to have these individuals help make this day a great success. We are also grateful for the legions of alumni, parents, students, other faculty, donors, and friends join us for this special day of learning and community. We are fortunate and we are made stronger and better by it. As a matter of point and pride, we had over 2,300 individuals join us on this day, and that's an all-time record. We hope to do this again next year. We hope to bring a little bit of the face-to-face back together, but if not, we know we can still come together in terms of seeing each other and learning from each other through this medium called Zoom. That said, I ask that you stay strong, you stay healthy, and you stay Caltech. Take care.